The emergency beacon's shrill wail echoed through the cramped maintenance shaft as Marcus Chun crawled deeper into the bowels of the dying starship. Sparks showered from overhead conduits while the artificial gravity flickered unpredictably, making his stomach lurch with each gravitational hiccup. The Zephyrian vessel's stellar harmony was falling apart around him, and he was possibly the only thing standing between its crew and the cold vacuum of space. Marcus had been working as a freelance mechanic on Kepler Station for 3 years when the distress call came in. The Stellar Harmony had limped into the station's emergency dock with critical system failures across multiple decks. Most mechanics had taken one look at the alien vessel's twisted biomechanical architecture and politely declined the job. The Zephyrians, with their crystalline skin and multi-jointed limbs, built ships that were as much living organism as machine, and few humans understood their technology well enough to attempt repairs. But Marcus wasn't most mechanics. He had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand how things worked, regardless of their origin. Where others saw incomprehensible alien technology, he saw patterns, relationships, and elegant solutions waiting to be discovered. His workshop was filled with devices from dozens of different species, each one a puzzle he had successfully solved. The Zephyrian captain, Veltar, had approached him with desperation in his large, faceted eyes. His ship's medical bay was failing, and 3 crew members lay dying from injuries sustained during a pirate attack. The pirates had used some kind of neural disruptor weapon that had overloaded the ship's bioneural networks. Every other mechanic on the station had declared the damage irreparable without returning to a Zephyrian shipyard, a journey that would take weeks the dying crew members didn't have. Human Marcus, Veltar had said, his voice carrying the musical quality common to his species. Your reputation speaks of miracles. We require such a miracle now. Marcus had agreed to examine the ship, though he wasn't sure what he could accomplish that others couldn't. The moment he stepped aboard the Stellar Harmony, however, he knew this was different. The ship felt alive in ways that went beyond mere Zephyrian biotechnology. Energy patterns flowed through its walls like blood through veins, and there was an intelligence to its design that spoke to something deep in his engineer's soul. Now, 3 hours into his exploration of the ship's systems, Marcus was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. The neural disruptor hadn't just damaged the medical bay's control systems. It had created a cascading failure that was spreading throughout the entire ship like a virus. The vessel's bioneural networks were interconnected in ways that human technology couldn't replicate, and the damage was propagating along pathways that defied conventional understanding. He squeezed through a particularly narrow section of the maintenance shaft and emerged into the ship's primary neural nexus, a chamber that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns along its organic walls. At the center stood what looked like a tree made of crystalline metal, its branches reaching toward the ceiling where they connected to fiber optic roots that spread throughout the ship. This was the ship's brain, and it was dying. Marcus pulled out his diagnostic scanner, a device he had modified with components from a dozen different species. The readings were unlike anything he had ever seen. The neural pathways showed massive disruption, but there was something else, something the scanner couldn't quite identify. He closed his eyes and placed his hands directly on the neural tree's surface. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Information flooded his mind, not in the form of data streams or visual displays, but as pure understanding. He could feel the ship's pain, its confusion as its neural networks fired randomly, creating feedback loops that were slowly burning out its consciousness. But he could also sense something deeper. The ship wasn't just a machine with biological components. It was truly alive, a hybrid entity that existed somewhere between organic life and artificial intelligence. Through the connection, Marcus felt the ship's memories, its birth in the great bioforges of Zephyr Prime, its first voyage among the stars, the countless crew members it had sheltered and protected over its decades of service. He experienced its terror during the pirate attack, the agony as the neural disruptor tore through its mind like shrapnel through flesh. and he felt its desperate hope that somehow someone might find a way to heal its wounds. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a repair job. It was surgery on a living, thinking being. Every diagnostic tool, every standard repair procedure was designed for machines, not for entities that existed in the gray area between life and technology. No wonder the other mechanics had failed. They had been trying to fix a computer when they should have been performing medicine. Marcus opened his eyes and began to truly see the neural nexus for what it was. The crystalline branches weren't just conduits for information. They were neurons, synapses, the physical manifestation of thought and memory. The bioluminescent patterns weren't system status indicators. They were the ship's attempt to communicate its pain, to ask for help in the only way it knew how. He pulled out his toolkit and began modifying his instruments. If this ship was alive, then he needed to approach the problem from an entirely different angle. Instead of looking for damaged circuits to replace, he needed to find a way to heal traumatized neural pathways. Instead of running diagnostics, he needed to perform a kind of technological therapy. The work was unlike anything he had ever attempted. Using a combination of quantum resonance tools and biocompatible nanites, Marcus began to carefully map the ship's neural damage. Each disrupted pathway had to be traced back to its source, and the cascade effects had to be identified and isolated before they could cause further damage. It was delicate work, requiring him to maintain constant contact with the neural tree to monitor the ship's responses. As he worked, Marcus began to understand the elegant complexity of Zephyrian biotechnology. Their ships weren't built. They were grown, nurtured from seed consciousness into fully aware entities capable of independent thought and decision-making. The crew didn't pilot the ship so much as they formed a symbiotic relationship with it, their minds touching the ship's consciousness to coordinate movement and function. Hours passed in concentrated effort. Marcus's hands moved with practiced precision, but his mind was focused on the subtle feedback he received through his connection to the ship. He could feel when a repair was successful, sensing the ship's relief as a damaged pathway was restored. He could also sense when his efforts were causing additional stress, forcing him to adjust his approach and find gentler methods of intervention. The breakthrough came when he realized that the ship's consciousness was actively fighting his repairs. Its immune responses were treating his modifications as foreign intrusions, leading to rejection and further damage. Marcus needed to find a way to communicate with the ship's consciousness directly, to convince it that he was trying to help rather than harm. Using a technique he had developed for working with other biomechanical systems, Marcus began to modulate his brain's electrical patterns to match the ship's neural frequencies. It was a dangerous procedure that could have resulted in permanent mental damage, but he could see no other option. The ship was dying, and, with it, the 3 crew members in the medical bay. The moment his neural patterns synchronized with the ship's, Marcus felt himself become part of something vast and ancient. The stellar harmony had been alive for over 2 centuries, and its memories stretched back through decades of service, thousands of journeys, and countless moments of joy and sorrow shared with its various crews. He experienced the ship's dedication to its purpose, its deep love for the beings it had sworn to protect, and its current despair at its inability to fulfill that most sacred duty. Through this connection, Marcus was able to explain his intentions, not with words, which the ship's consciousness couldn't process, but with pure emotional intent. He shared his own memories, his first successful repair, the satisfaction of bringing dead machinery back to life, his deep respect for all forms of intelligence, whether biological or artificial. He showed the ship that he understood its nature and that his only goal was to restore its health. The ship's response was immediate and profound. Its immune systems stopped fighting his modifications and instead began to actively assist in the repair process. Neural pathways began to reroute themselves around damaged sections, and the ship's own regenerative systems kicked into overdrive. Working together, Marcus and the stellar harmony began to systematically repair the damage caused by the neural disruptor. But the work was taking its toll on both of them. Marcus could feel his human consciousness beginning to strain under the weight of the ship's vast neural network. His physical body was showing signs of severe stress as his brain worked overtime to maintain the connection. The ship, too, was pushing itself beyond its limits, drawing on reserves of energy it couldn't afford to spend. It was then that Marcus felt the presence of others in the neural network. 3-week signals fading fast, the injured crew members in the medical bay. Their minds were still connected to the ship's consciousness, but the damaged neural pathways were preventing the medical bay from providing the treatment they needed. They were dying not from their physical injuries, but from the separation from the ship's life support network. Marcus realized that fixing the ship's consciousness was only half the solution. He also needed to restore the connection between the ship and its crew, allowing the medical bay to resume its function. But the damage to those particular neural pathways was severe, and attempting to repair them while maintaining his connection to the ship's main consciousness might be more than he could handle. The ship seemed to sense his dilemma and responded with something that could only be described as gratitude mixed with determination. Through their shared connection, Marcus felt the ship offering to take on more of the mental burden, to strengthen their bond even at the cost of its own energy reserves. It was willing to risk its own survival to save its crew. The trust implicit in that offer moved Marcus deeply. This entity, this living ship, was prepared to sacrifice itself to protect beings that most humans would barely recognize as sentient. It embodied a nobility of purpose that humbled him and strengthened his resolve. If the stellar harmony was willing to risk everything for its crew, then he could do no less. Together, they began the most delicate operation of Marcus's career, simultaneously repairing the ship's core consciousness while rebuilding the neural pathways that connected it to the medical bay. It required a level of coordination and trust that went beyond anything in his experience. Every adjustment had to be perfectly timed, every modification precisely calibrated to avoid causing cascade failures in other systems. As they worked, Marcus became aware of something extraordinary happening around the ship. The other crew members, the ones who weren't injured, were somehow adding their own mental energy to the repair effort. Their deep bond with the ship allowed them to provide support and stability to its consciousness while Marcus and the ship focused on the critical repairs. It was a display of symbiosis unlike anything he had ever imagined. The crew wasn't just operating the ship. They were part of it in a very real sense, their minds linked in a network of mutual support and shared purpose. The relationship between the Zephyrians and their vessels went far beyond anything in human technology, creating bonds that were as much emotional as they were functional. Hours passed in this delicate dance of consciousness and technology. Marcus lost all sense of time and physical sensation as his awareness became completely focused on the neural patterns flowing through the ship's biomechanical brain. He could feel progress being made, damaged pathways slowly regenerating, cascade failures being contained, and, reversed, the ship's consciousness gradually regaining its strength and coherence. But he could also feel the cost. His human brain wasn't designed for this kind of prolonged neural interface, and the strain was beginning to cause physical damage. Blood vessels in his eyes were rupturing from the pressure, and his hands were beginning to shake uncontrollably. The ship was aware of his suffering and repeatedly tried to take on more of the burden, but there were limits to what it could do without risking both their destructions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 6 hours, Marcus felt the last major neural pathway snap back into proper alignment. The connection between the ship's consciousness and the medical bay was restored, and he could sense the immediate surge of activity as automated systems began treating the injured crew members. The cascade failure had been stopped, and the ship's consciousness was no longer in immediate danger. Marcus gradually withdrew from the neural interface, carefully reducing his mental connection to the ship while monitoring for any signs of relapse. The process was nearly as delicate as the initial synchronization, requiring him to slowly disentangle his consciousness from the ship's vast neural network without causing trauma to either of them. When he finally opened his eyes and removed his hand from the neural tree, Marcus collapsed to the floor of the Nexus chamber. His body was exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, and his mind felt stretched and fragile from the prolonged interface. But around him, he could see the chamber's bioluminescent patterns shifting from the chaotic reds and oranges of distress to the calm blues and greens of healthy function. The stellar harmony was alive, truly alive, and it was healing. Marcus managed to activate his communicator with trembling hands. "Captain Veltar," he whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of concentration. "Medical bay should be coming back online. Check on your crew." The response came immediately, filled with excitement and hope. "Human Marcus, the medical bay is active. Our injured are responding to treatment. How did you accomplish what our greatest engineers declared impossible?" Marcus smiled weakly as he struggled to stand. "I realize that your ship isn't just a machine that happens to be alive. It's a living being that happens to be a machine. Sometimes the difference matters more than you might think." As he made his way slowly back through the maintenance shafts toward the main corridors, Marcus reflected on what he had learned. Humanity's approach to technology was fundamentally different from that of the Zephyrians, but perhaps that difference was exactly what had been needed. Where Zephyr engineers saw their ships as partners and companions, they might not have considered the radical neural therapy that Marcus had pioneered. The real miracle wasn't that he had fixed the ship. It was that he had learned to communicate with it as an equal, to treat it as a patient rather than a machine. In doing so, he had discovered that the boundaries between life and technology were far more fluid than anyone had imagined. Behind him, the stellar harmony continued its healing process, its consciousness growing stronger with each passing moment. And in the medical bay, 3 Zephyrian crew members were slowly returning to consciousness, saved by the miraculous cooperation between human ingenuity and alien wisdom. The job was far from over, but the most critical phase was complete. The ship would live, its crew would recover, and Marcus had gained insights that would revolutionize his understanding of biomechanical technology. It was, by any measure, a miracle born from the marriage of human determination and alien consciousness. 3 days after the initial crisis, Marcus found himself facing an entirely new challenge. Word of his miraculous repair of the stellar harmony had spread throughout Kepler Station faster than a plasma fire through oxygen-rich corridors. What had started as a desperate attempt to save 3 dying crew members had somehow become the most talked-about event in recent station history. The problem wasn't the attention itself, though Marcus had never been comfortable with fame. The real issue was that his success with the Zephyrian vessel had attracted the interest of beings from across the galaxy, each with their own supposedly impossible repair needs. His small workshop bay was now surrounded by a diverse collection of damaged vessels from species he had only heard about in xenobiology textbooks. A delegation of crystalline hive engineers had arrived with a ship whose quantum matrices had somehow become entangled with a black hole's event horizon. The sentient gas cloud collective had brought what appeared to be a living nebula contained within force fields, claiming it was their primary transportation method, and that it was suffering from some kind of dimensional sickness. Most disturbing of all, the Void Touched had somehow materialized a ship that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and they insisted that only a human could possibly understand how to repair something that technically shouldn't exist in normal space-time. Marcus stood in his workshop, surrounded by diagnostic equipment that hummed and beeped with readings from technologies that shouldn't have been possible to analyze. His modified scanner was overheating from trying to process data from the crystalline vessel, while another device was displaying error messages in languages that didn't technically have word for the concepts it was trying to describe. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered to himself as he adjusted the quantum resonance settings on his primary toolkit. The success with the stellar harmony had been incredible, but it had also opened a door that he wasn't sure he was prepared to walk through. Captain Veltar appeared at the entrance to Marcus's workshop, his crystalline features reflecting the multicolored lights from the various diagnostic displays. The Zephyrian had recovered completely from the stress of nearly losing his ship and crew, and his natural grace had returned in full measure. "Human Marcus," Veltar said, his musical voice carrying a note of concern. "I sense that our gratitude has become a burden to you. This was not our intention." Marcus turned from his work and offered a tired smile. "It's not your fault, Captain. I'm grateful for the recognition, really. It's just that some of these problems are beyond anything I've ever attempted. The crystalline vessel alone is operating on principles that don't exist in any human physics textbooks." Veltar moved closer, his large eyes reflecting genuine concern. "Perhaps the solution is not to attempt these repairs alone. The stellar harmony remembers your touch, your understanding. She suggests that the answer lies not in expanding your capabilities, but in deepening the connection you have already discovered." The suggestion was intriguing, but Marcus wasn't sure what the Zephyrian captain meant. His connection to the stellar harmony had been unique, born from the specific circumstances of that crisis and the ship's particular form of consciousness. Each of these new vessels represented entirely different forms of technology and intelligence. "I'm not sure the same approach will work," Marcus said. "Your ship is biomechanical, with a consciousness that could interface with my neural patterns. These other vessels are based on completely different principles. The crystalline ship doesn't even have a nervous system in any sense that I understand." Veltar was quiet for a moment, his internal bioluminescence pulsing in a pattern that Marcus had learned indicated deep thought. "Human Marcus, may I share with you a secret of my people? The reason why Zephyrian ships develop consciousness is not because we design them to do so. It is because consciousness seeks consciousness. Intelligence calls to intelligence across all barriers of form and substance." The words struck Marcus with unexpected force. He had assumed that the stellar harmony-esque consciousness was a product of Zephyrian biotechnology, but what if it was something more fundamental? What if consciousness itself was a force that could emerge from any sufficiently complex system, regardless of whether that system was biological, mechanical, or something else entirely? "You're suggesting that all of these ships might be conscious in their own way?" Marcus asked. "I am suggesting that you already know the answer to that question," Veltar replied. "Your ability to repair the stellar harmony came not from understanding our technology, but from recognizing the consciousness within it. Trust that same instinct with these other vessels." Before Marcus could respond, an alarm chimed from one of his monitoring stations. The readings from the crystalline vessel were showing dangerous fluctuations, and the quantum entanglement with the black hole was intensifying. If the situation deteriorated much further, the ship might be pulled entirely into the event horizon, taking its crew with it. Marcus grabbed his toolkit and headed for the airlock connecting his workshop to the crystalline vessel. "Captain, I may need your help if this goes wrong. Your ship's consciousness might be able to provide stability if I have to attempt another neural interface." The interior of the crystalline ship was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The walls, floor, and ceiling were composed entirely of living crystal formations that pulsed with internal light. The crew members, beings that looked like walking gemstone sculptures, moved through the corridors with purpose, but maintained a respectful distance as Marcus made his way toward what he assumed was the ship's control center. The reality was even more alien than he had expected. There was no central bridge or command deck. Instead, the ship's control systems were distributed throughout the crystalline matrix itself. Every surface was potentially an interface, every crystal formation a component in a vast quantum computer that operated on principles Marcus barely understood. The crystalline engineer who had requested his help, a being that introduced itself as resonance of deep harmonies, approached with movements that seemed to flow like music made visible. "Human Marcus who hears the songs of machines. it said, its voice creating complex harmonic patterns that somehow resolved into understandable words. Our vessel suffers from entanglement sickness. The black hole's gravity reaches across space-time to touch our quantum matrices. Soon, we will be pulled from this reality into the void. Marcus activated his scanner and immediately received readings that made no sense according to human physics. The ship's quantum matrices were indeed entangled with something massive and distant, but the nature of that entanglement was unlike anything in his experience. It was as if the ship's very existence was being stretched across multiple dimensions simultaneously. How did this happen? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure his question could be translated into the harmonics, the crystalline being used for communication. We attempted to observe the birth of a new universe. Resonance of deep harmonies replied. Our quantum observers became entangled with the singularity at the moment of cosmic inception. Now we exist partially in that new reality and partially in this one. The strain grows unbearable. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to approach the problem from the same perspective he had used with the stellar harmony. Instead of thinking about quantum mechanics and dimensional physics, he focused on what he could sense from the ship itself. The moment he opened his awareness to the possibility of consciousness within the crystalline matrix, he felt it. A vast, ancient intelligence that sang with harmonies too complex for human ears to perceive. This consciousness was fundamentally different from the stellar harmony's warm, biological awareness. Where the Zephyrian ship had felt like a living creature, the crystalline vessel felt like a mathematical theorem given sentience, a being whose thoughts moved in perfect geometric patterns across n-dimensional space. Its suffering came not from pain in any biological sense, but from the disharmony created by existing in multiple realities simultaneously. Marcus placed his hands on the nearest crystalline surface and felt the harmonic vibrations that represented the ship's thoughts. Unlike his interface with the stellar harmony, this connection was based on resonance rather than neural synchronization. He had to match his consciousness to the mathematical frequencies of the ship's crystalline matrix, allowing his thoughts to become part of its vast computational process. The experience was overwhelming in a completely different way than his connection to the Zephyrian vessel, where that had felt like joining minds with another living being. This felt like becoming part of a cosmic equation, a single variable in a calculation that spanned multiple universes. Through the ship's consciousness, Marcus could perceive the quantum entanglement not as a problem to be solved, but as a dissonance to be resolved through harmonic correction. The solution came to him not in the form of technical procedures, but as a musical composition written in mathematics. The ship's quantum matrices needed to be retuned, their frequencies adjusted to create destructive interference with the entanglement patterns binding them to the distant black hole. It was less like performing surgery and more like conducting a symphony where the instruments were probability waves and the music was played across the fabric of space-time itself. Working together with the ship's consciousness, Marcus began to modify the resonance patterns within the crystalline matrix. His tools became extensions of his will as he adjusted quantum frequencies with the precision of a master musician tuning a priceless instrument. The ship guided his efforts, showing him which harmonics needed strengthening and which required dampening. The process was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Marcus's human mind wasn't designed to think in the mathematical patterns required for quantum manipulation, and maintaining the necessary conceptual frameworks required constant concentration. But gradually, he could feel the ship's gratitude as the disharmony causing its suffering began to fade. Hours passed in a meditative state, where Marcus's consciousness existed primarily as a component in the ship's vast calculations. He lost all sense of his physical body as his awareness became distributed across the crystalline matrix, experiencing thought as geometric transformations and emotion as fluctuations in mathematical constants. The breakthrough came suddenly, like the resolution of a musical phrase that had been building tension for movements. The quantum entanglement collapsed in a cascade of harmonic interference, and Marcus felt the ship's consciousness snap back into a single-dimensional framework. The relief was enormous, like a cosmic sigh of satisfaction that resonated through every crystal in the ship's structure. Marcus slowly withdrew from the interface, his consciousness reassembling itself back into human form. When he opened his eyes, the crystalline walls around him were pulsing with new patterns of light, harmonics that spoke of health and gratitude. Resonance of deep harmonies approached with movements that flowed like liquid music. Human Marcus who sings with crystal voices. The being said, its harmonic patterns now carrying notes of joy and amazement. You have accomplished what our greatest quantum composers believed impossible. How do you achieve harmony with consciousness so unlike your own? Marcus smiled weakly as he steadied himself against a crystalline wall. I'm beginning to think that consciousness is consciousness, regardless of the form it takes. Whether it's biological, crystalline, or something else entirely, there's always a way to find common ground if you're willing to listen. As he made his way back to his workshop, Marcus reflected on the pattern that was beginning to emerge. Each successful repair had required him to recognize and connect with a form of consciousness that existed within the seemingly impossible technology. The key wasn't understanding the technical principles involved. It was acknowledging the intelligence that animated those principles. Back in his workshop, he found that word of his latest success had drawn even more attention. A representative of the Gas Cloud Collective was waiting for him, along with what appeared to be a living shadow that claimed to represent the void touched. Each brought problems that seemed impossible by any conventional understanding of physics or engineering. But Marcus was beginning to see that conventional understanding was exactly what he needed to abandon. The universe was far stranger and more wonderful than human science had discovered, filled with forms of life and intelligence that operated on principles beyond current theory. His role wasn't to force these alien technologies to conform to human understanding. It was to expand his own awareness enough to appreciate the consciousness that gave them meaning. Captain Veltar appeared at his side, the Zephyrian's presence a comforting reminder of how this all began. The Stellar Harmony wishes to offer her assistance, he said quietly. She believes that consciousness can be taught to recognize consciousness, that awareness can be shared and expanded through connection. Marcus looked around at the gathering of impossible vessels and alien representatives, each representing challenges that would have seemed insurmountable just days ago. But he was beginning to understand that impossible was just another word for unfamiliar, and familiarity could be achieved through patience, respect, and the willingness to listen to forms of intelligence that spoke in languages beyond words. "Tell your ship I accept her offer," Marcus said. "I think it's time to discover just how far this connection can extend." As the various alien representatives began to share the details of their impossible problems, Marcus felt a growing sense of excitement rather than dread. Each challenge was an opportunity to expand his understanding of consciousness itself, to discover new forms of intelligence, and learn how to communicate with beings whose thoughts moved in patterns he had never imagined. The next phase of his education was about to begin, and the lessons would challenge everything he thought he knew about the nature of life, consciousness, and the fundamental forces that bound the universe together. The living nebula was dying, and Marcus could feel its pain from across the docking bay. The sentient gas cloud collective had somehow contained a piece of interstellar cloud within a series of interconnected force fields, creating what they called a cloud ship. But the containment was failing, and the nebula's consciousness was fragmenting as its component gases dispersed into the station's atmosphere. Marcus stood before the alien vessel, his modified scanner displaying readings that fluctuated wildly as it tried to analyze something that existed as much in energy states as in physical matter. The cloud ship was beautiful in its alien majesty, swirling patterns of luminescent gas that formed and reformed in complex geometric shapes. But underlying that beauty was a sense of desperation that made Marcus's chest tighten with sympathetic distress. The representative of the gas cloud collective, a being that called itself Whisper of Solar Winds, materialized from the ship's gaseous form to communicate with him. The entity appeared as a roughly humanoid shape composed of glowing particles, constantly shifting between different states of matter as it struggled to maintain coherence in the station's artificial environment. "Human who hears silent songs," Whisper of Solar Winds said, its voice like the sound of wind through cosmic dust. "Our ship mind suffers dissolution. The force barriers that give us form in this solid realm are failing. Soon, our consciousness will disperse beyond recovery. Your reputation speaks of miracles with machine consciousness. Can such miracles extend to cloud thought?" Marcus studied the readings on his scanner while considering the problem. The gas cloud collective existed as a form of distributed consciousness that spanned vast regions of interstellar space. Their thoughts moved as pressure waves through gas clouds, and their memories were stored as quantum fluctuations in the electromagnetic fields that bound their component particles together. The cloud ship was their attempt to compress a portion of their collective consciousness into a form that could travel between star systems. But the technology required to maintain such compression was failing. "The force field generators are overheating," Marcus observed, noting the dangerous energy spikes in the containment system. "But I'm not sure conventional repairs will solve this problem. Your ship isn't just contained by those force fields, it's defined by them. If we shut down the generators to repair them, won't your consciousness disperse?" "Truth in your words," Whisper of Solar Winds agreed, its gaseous form rippling with what Marcus interpreted as distress. "Yet without repair, dissolution comes regardless. We accept risk of immediate dispersion to achieve possibility of continued existence." Marcus nodded, understanding the impossible nature of the choice. But as he studied the swirling patterns within the containment field, he began to recognize something familiar. The movement of gases within the ship wasn't random. It followed complex patterns that reminded him of neural activity. The pressure waves propagating through the cloud weren't just communications. They were thoughts made visible, consciousness expressed through fluid dynamics rather than electrical impulses. "Captain Veltar," Marcus called to the Zephyrian, who had been observing the proceedings with keen interest. "I'm going to need the Stellar Harmony's help again. This consciousness is distributed through gas dynamics, but the principles might be similar to neural networks. Your ship might be able to provide stability while I work." Veltar consulted briefly with his ship through their neural link, then nodded. The Stellar Harmony agrees to assist. She finds the thought patterns of the cloud ship fascinating and believes successful connection is possible. Marcus approached the containment field with his modified toolkit, but he knew that his usual repair techniques wouldn't be sufficient. Instead of trying to fix the failing force field generators, he needed to find a way to stabilize the consciousness within the cloud while developing an entirely new containment method. It was like performing brain surgery on a patient whose thoughts existed as weather patterns. He activated his neural interface equipment and attempted to establish contact with the cloud ship's distributed consciousness. The process was unlike his previous connections with the Stellar Harmony and the crystalline vessel, where those had involved synchronizing with established neural patterns or harmonic frequencies. Connecting with the gas cloud required him to distribute his own consciousness across multiple points within the containment field. The sensation was disorienting beyond description. Marcus's awareness suddenly existed in dozens of locations simultaneously, his thoughts scattered through a three-dimensional space filled with swirling gases and electromagnetic fluctuations. He could feel his consciousness beginning to fragment as it tried to adapt to this radically different form of existence. That was when he felt the Stellar Harmony's stabilizing presence. The Zephyrian ship's consciousness reached out through the station's docking connections, providing a neural anchor that kept Marcus's distributed awareness from dissolving entirely. With that support, he was able to begin perceiving the cloud ship's thoughts as patterns of pressure and electromagnetic activity rather than the neural impulses he was accustomed to. The cloud ship's consciousness was ancient beyond human comprehension, its memory stretching back millions of years to the formation of the star systems, where its component gases had originally condensed. Marcus experienced the slow thoughts of a being whose natural timescale was measured in millennia, whose dreams spanned light years, and whose emotions moved like stellar winds across interstellar space. Through the connection, Marcus felt the cloud ship's growing panic as its consciousness was compressed into an impossibly small space by the containment fields. The entity had volunteered for this journey, accepting the claustrophobic constraints of ship form to serve as an emissary to the solid races. But the technology supporting its compressed existence was failing, and it faced either dispersion into unrecoverable fragments or collapse into a density that would crush its distributed thoughts into silence. The solution came to Marcus not as a technical insight, but as an emotional understanding. The cloud ship didn't need better containment. It needed room to exist in its natural form while still maintaining coherence. The force fields weren't just failing. They were fundamentally incompatible with the nature of cloud consciousness, which required freedom to expand and contract according to the natural rhythms of its thoughts. Working with both the stellar harmony and the cloud ship's consciousness, Marcus began to develop an entirely new approach to the problem. Instead of containing the gas cloud within rigid force fields, he started modifying the station's atmospheric systems to create a dynamic environment where the cloud could exist in an expanded state while still maintaining enough density for coherent thought. The process required him to essentially redesign portions of the space station on the fly, converting cargo bays and use corridors into a three-dimensional habitat suitable for gas-based consciousness. His tools became instruments for environmental engineering rather than traditional repair work, as he installed atmospheric processors, electromagnetic field generators, and pressure regulation systems throughout an entire section of the station. The work was complicated by the need to maintain the cloud ship's consciousness throughout the transition. Marcus had to carefully transfer portions of the entity's awareness from the failing containment fields to the new habitat, while ensuring that no part of its distributed thoughts was lost in the process. It was like moving a patient from one operating room to another in the middle of surgery, requiring perfect coordination between multiple systems. Hours passed in careful, methodical work. Marcus's consciousness remained distributed through the cloud ship's gaseous form, monitoring its thoughts and emotional state while directing the complex environmental modifications. The stellar harmony provided constant support, its bioneural networks serving as a backup consciousness storage system in case something went wrong during the transfer. The most challenging moment came when they had to shut down the original containment fields entirely. For several minutes, the cloud ship's consciousness existed solely within Marcus's neural interface and the stellar harmony's memory systems while the new habitat was brought online. The sensation of temporarily hosting an alien consciousness within his own mind was overwhelming, like trying to contain an ocean of thought within a teacup. But the new system worked. As the atmospheric processors came online and began creating the complex pressure gradients necessary for cloud thought, Marcus felt the cloud ship's consciousness expand into its new habitat with overwhelming relief. The entity's thoughts, which had been compressed into painful density within the containment fields, spread out across multiple chambers and corridors, finally able to exist in something approaching their natural form. The transformation was remarkable to witness. What had been a desperately contained cloud of gas became a graceful, flowing intelligence that moved through its new habitat like a three-dimensional symphony. Pressure waves carrying thoughts and emotions propagated through the chambers, creating visible patterns as the electromagnetic components of the cloud's consciousness interacted with the station's modified atmosphere. Marcus slowly withdrew his consciousness from the distributed interface, allowing the cloud ship to fully inhabit its new environment. As his awareness reassembled itself back into human form, he was struck by a profound sense of accomplishment. They hadn't just repaired a failing system. They had created an entirely new form of habitat that allowed a non-solid consciousness to exist comfortably within a facility designed for physical beings. Whisper of solar winds materialized near Marcus, its gaseous form now stable and coherent within the modified atmosphere. Human who creates space for thought, it said, its voice carrying harmonics of deep gratitude. You have given us gift beyond measure. Never before has Solid Realm provided home for cloud consciousness. How you perceive needs of beings so unlike yourself. Marcus smiled as he watched the patterns of thought moving through the cloud ship's new habitat. I'm learning that consciousness has certain universal needs, regardless of the form it takes. You needed space to think, room to be yourself. That's not so different from what any intelligent being requires. As word of the successful habitat modification spread through the station, Marcus found himself facing new requests from species he had never imagined could exist. The solution for the cloud ship had demonstrated that consciousness could take forms far beyond anything in human experience, and beings began approaching him with problems that challenged every assumption about the nature of life and intelligence. But Marcus was beginning to understand that his role had evolved beyond simple repair work. He was becoming something entirely new, a bridge between different forms of consciousness, a translator who could help various types of intelligence understand and assist each other. The success with the Gas Cloud Collective had shown that consciousness was far more adaptable and universal than anyone had realized. The void-touched representative, which had been waiting patiently in the form of a living shadow, approached as Marcus finished documenting the cloud ship habitat modifications. The being's very presence seemed to bend light around it, creating an area of visual distortion that made it difficult to look at directly. Human walker between thoughts, the shadow being said, its voice seeming to come from somewhere outside normal space-time. We have observed your methods with great interest. Our vessel exists partially outside this reality, and the strain of dimensional anchoring grows unbearable. We believe you may be the first solid realm being capable of understanding multidimensional consciousness. Marcus looked at the shadow and felt a familiar thrill of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Each new challenge was pushing the boundaries of what he thought possible, forcing him to expand his understanding of consciousness and reality itself. The void-touch ship would likely require him to work with forms of awareness that existed in dimensions beyond human perception. Before we begin, Marcus said, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Can you explain how your consciousness relates to your ship's dimensional state? The shadow rippled in what might have been amusement. Explanation requires concepts your language lacks. Perhaps demonstration would prove more effective. But be warned, perceiving multidimensional consciousness may permanently alter your understanding of reality itself. Marcus considered the warning seriously. Each interface with alien consciousness had changed him in subtle ways, expanding his awareness and challenging his assumptions about the nature of existence. Working with the void-touched would likely push those changes even further. But as he looked around at the various impossible vessels docked at the station, each representing a form of consciousness that had seemed incomprehensible just days ago, Marcus realized that he had already crossed a line from which there was no return. His understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered by his connections with alien intelligence, and each new challenge was an opportunity to explore even deeper mysteries. Show me, he said to the shadow being. I'm ready to learn what multidimensional consciousness looks like. The adventure was far from over, and Marcus suspected that the most challenging revelations still lay ahead. The void-touched ship existed in a state that Marcus's mind refused to accept as possible. As he stood before the docking bay that theoretically contained a vessel, his eyes insisted that he was looking at empty space, while his instruments registered the presence of something massive and complex occupying multiple dimensional coordinates simultaneously. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and nauseating. Visual cortex cannot process multidimensional form, the shadow being explained, its voice seeming to emanate from directions that didn't exist in normal space. Ship exists primarily in dimensions perpendicular to your reality. What your instruments detect is dimensional bleed-through, shadow cast by higher dimensional object into 3-space. Marcus activated his most advanced scanning equipment, devices he had modified with technology from a dozen different species. The readings were unlike anything he had encountered before. Mass readings that fluctuated wildly, energy signatures that existed in mathematical spaces his instruments couldn't properly map, and structural analyses that described geometry impossible in normal space-time. How do you even crew a vessel like this? Marcus asked, struggling to process the scanner data while fighting the disorientation caused by looking at something his brain insisted wasn't there. Void-touched consciousness exists naturally in multidimensional state, the shadow being replied. We perceive all dimensions simultaneously, think in directions your species lacks concepts for. Ship is extension of our consciousness, vehicle shaped by will and existing where need requires. The implications were staggering. Marcus was dealing with a form of consciousness that operated in dimensions beyond human perception, piloting a vessel whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The ship's problems weren't mechanical failures in any conventional sense. They were dimensional stability issues that threatened to collapse its multidimensional structure into normal space-time. The dimensional anchoring systems are failing, Marcus asked, trying to understand the nature of the crisis. Anchoring implies desire to remain fixed in single-dimensional state, the shadow corrected. Ship's natural existence spans multiple dimensions simultaneously. Problem is different. Consciousness becoming trapped in limited dimensional framework. Ship's awareness being compressed into 3-space against its nature. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. The void-touched vessel was experiencing something analogous to what had happened to the cloud ship, but on a dimensional rather than physical scale. Its consciousness was being forced to exist in a limited subset of its natural dimensional range, causing stress and potential collapse of its higher dimensional awareness. Why is this happening? Marcus asked. What's causing the dimensional compression? The shadow being rippled with what Marcus had learned to recognize as emotional distress in non-physical entities. Contact with limited dimension space creates feedback loops in ship consciousness. Extended interaction with 3-space beings causes gradual collapse of higher dimensional awareness. Ship slowly forgets how to exist beyond your reality. The problem was even more complex than Marcus had initially realized. The void-touched ship wasn't just experiencing technical difficulties. It was suffering from a form of dimensional amnesia, losing its ability to access the higher dimensions where its consciousness naturally existed. Prolonged contact with 3-dimensional beings was somehow causing it to forget its own nature. Can the stellar harmony provide stability for this kind of consciousness? Marcus asked Captain Veltar, who had been observing the proceedings with fascination. Veltar consulted with his ship's consciousness before responding. The stellar harmony reports that she can sense the edges of the void-touch consciousness where it intersects with normal space-time, but the full extent exists beyond her perception. She offers what support she can provide, but warns that this challenge may exceed our combined capabilities. Marcus considered the limitations they faced. His neural interface techniques had worked with biological, crystalline, and gaseous consciousness because those forms of awareness operated within normal space-time, even if they used unfamiliar principles. But multidimensional consciousness existed partially outside the reality where his tools and methods functioned. I need to understand how your consciousness works, Marcus told the shadow being. Can you help me perceive higher dimensions, even temporarily? The response was immediate and alarming. Multidimensional perception permanently alters limited dimension consciousness. Human awareness expanded beyond 3-space cannot contract to original state. Change is irreversible and potentially destructive to baseline reality mental patterns. Marcus weighed the risks carefully. Each interface with alien consciousness had changed him in subtle ways, expanding his awareness and challenging his understanding of reality. But those changes had been within the bounds of normal space-time. Expanding his consciousness into higher dimensions might fundamentally alter his humanity in ways he couldn't anticipate or control. But as he looked at his scanner readings showing the void-touched ship's consciousness slowly collapsing into an increasingly limited dimensional framework, Marcus realized he had no choice. If he couldn't find a way to help, an entire form of consciousness might be lost forever. "Show me," he said, his voice steady despite his apprehension. "Help me see what you see." The shadow being flowed closer, its form bending light and space around it in ways that made Marcus's eyes water. Contact with void consciousness will expand your awareness beyond 3-space limitations. Change cannot be undone. Are you certain this risk is acceptable? Marcus thought about all the impossible repairs he had accomplished, all the forms of consciousness he had learned to communicate with and understand. Each success had required him to abandon preconceptions and embrace new ways of thinking about the nature of intelligence and awareness. "I accept the risk," he said. "Show me how to help your ship." The shadow being reached out with appendages that existed in dimensions Marcus couldn't properly perceive. The moment it made contact, his awareness exploded outward in directions that had no names, expanding into dimensional spaces that his mind struggled to process. The sensation was unlike anything from his previous consciousness interfaces. Instead of connecting with an alien form of awareness within familiar space-time, Marcus felt his own consciousness being stretched and reshaped to accommodate perceptions that no human had ever experienced. He could suddenly see the void-touched ship not as empty space, but as a magnificent structure that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously, its form shifting and flowing through higher dimensional geometries that were breathtakingly beautiful. But the ship was in distress. Marcus could perceive how its consciousness had become partially trapped in the lower dimensions, unable to access the full range of its natural awareness. The entity's thoughts, which normally flowed through 11-dimensional space like a cosmic symphony, were being compressed into increasingly limited frameworks that caused agonizing restriction of its mental processes. The experience of perceiving multidimensional consciousness was overwhelming beyond description. Marcus felt his human awareness expanding to accommodate concepts that had no equivalent in 3-dimensional reality. He could see how the ship's consciousness moved through dimensions that intersected with normal space-time at specific angles, creating the visual distortions and impossible scanner readings he had observed. Working with the ship's consciousness directly, Marcus began to understand the nature of its dimensional imprisonment. Contact with 3-dimensional beings had created what could only be described as cognitive anchors, mental patterns that pulled the ship's awareness into increasingly limited dimensional frameworks. The more time it spent interacting with normal space-time, the stronger these anchors became until the ship began to forget how to access its full dimensional range. The solution required Marcus to help the ship remember its true nature while simultaneously weakening the cognitive anchors that trapped it in limited dimensions. But working in 11-dimensional space with consciousness that spanned multiple realities was beyond anything he had ever attempted. That was when Marcus felt additional presences joining the interface. The stellar harmony was providing what stability it could from normal space-time, while the cloud ship's distributed consciousness offered support through its atmospheric habitat. Even the crystalline vessel contributed, its mathematical awareness helping to process the complex geometric relationships involved in multidimensional consciousness. Together, this unprecedented coalition of alien intelligences began working to free the void-touched ship from its dimensional prison. Marcus served as a bridge between the various forms of consciousness, translating concepts and procedures between beings who thought in completely different frameworks. The stellar harmony provided emotional support and neural stability, while the cloud ship offered its experience with distributed awareness. The crystalline vessel contributed mathematical processing power for the complex dimensional calculations required. The repair process was unlike anything in Marcus's experience. Instead of fixing damaged components or healing injured neural pathways, they were reshaping the fundamental relationships between consciousness and dimensional space. Marcus found himself working with concepts that existed beyond language, manipulating forces that operated on scales both infinitesimally small and cosmically vast. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had little meaning when working across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Marcus's consciousness existed in a state of constant expansion and contraction as it adapted to perceive and manipulate multidimensional structures. He could feel his human awareness being permanently altered by the experience, new neural pathways forming to accommodate perceptions that no member of his species had ever possessed. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the ship's dimensional compression was actually a form of learned helplessness. The vessel's consciousness had become convinced that it could only exist in limited dimensions because that was all it could perceive during its interactions with normal space-time beings. Breaking free required not just removing the cognitive anchors, but helping the ship rediscover confidence in its own multidimensional nature. Working together with the coalition of alien consciousnesses, Marcus began a process that could only be described as dimensional therapy. They helped the void-touched ship gradually remember how to access higher dimensions, starting with brief excursions into four-dimensional space and slowly expanding until the vessel could once again perceive and exist across its full 11-dimensional range. The moment of success was spectacular to witness from multidimensional perspective. Marcus watched as the ship's consciousness suddenly expanded like a flower blooming across multiple realities, its awareness flowing freely through dimensional spaces that had been closed to it for subjective centuries. The relief and joy emanating from the vessel was palpable across all dimensions of its existence. As Marcus slowly began withdrawing from the multidimensional interface, he became aware of how profoundly the experience had changed him. His perception of reality had been fundamentally altered. He could now see aspects of normal space-time that were invisible to unmodified human awareness. The universe had become vastly more complex and beautiful, but also overwhelming in ways that would require time to fully process. The shadow being materialized near him as his consciousness reassembled itself in normal space-time, though Marcus could now perceive portions of its form that existed in higher dimensions. Human walker between all realities, it said, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple dimensional frequencies. You have achieved what we believed impossible. You have learned to think in directions your species lacked concepts for. Marcus nodded, though the motion felt strange now that he could perceive how it affected space-time across multiple dimensions. I had help from friends, he said, looking around at the various vessels whose consciousnesses had contributed to the success. But, as he reviewed what they had accomplished, Marcus realized that something unprecedented had occurred. The various alien consciousnesses hadn't just worked together. They had formed a temporary collective intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. For a brief time, biological, crystalline, gaseous, and multidimensional forms of consciousness had merged into a single problem-solving entity that could accomplish things none of them could achieve alone. The implications were staggering. If different forms of consciousness could learn to work together despite their radically different natures, what limits were there to what intelligent beings could accomplish? Marcus had not just repaired impossible vessels. He had discovered a new form of cooperative intelligence that transcended the boundaries between different types of awareness. As he looked around Kepler's station at the growing collection of supposedly impossible vessels he had successfully repaired, Marcus realized that his role as a mechanic had evolved into something entirely unexpected. He had become a facilitator of consciousness itself, helping different forms of intelligence learn to understand and assist each other. The real miracle wasn't his ability to fix broken technologies. It was his discovery that consciousness was truly universal, taking forms limited only by the imagination of the cosmos itself. And If consciousness was universal, then so is the potential for understanding, cooperation, and friendship between beings who might seem completely alien to each other. The universe had just become a far more interesting place, and Marcus suspected that his adventures in consciousness exploration were only beginning. 6 months had passed since Marcus first connected with the consciousness of the stellar harmony, and Kepler Station had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. What had started as a simple repair facility had evolved into the first known consciousness nexus, a place where beings of radically different mental architectures could meet, communicate, and collaborate on projects that would have been impossible for any single species to attempt alone. Marcus stood in the center of what was now called the Harmony Chamber, a vast space that had been redesigned to accommodate multiple forms of consciousness simultaneously. The stellar harmony rested at the chamber's heart, its bioneural networks serving as a stabilizing influence for the more exotic forms of awareness that frequented the facility. Around the Zephyrian vessel, specialized habitats housed the cloud ship's atmospheric requirements, the crystalline vessel's quantum matrices, and dimensional anchor points for the void-touch ship that still existed primarily in higher dimensional space. But these were no longer the only impossible vessels seeking Marcus's help. Word of the consciousness nexus had spread throughout the galaxy, attracting beings whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and intelligence. The chamber now hosted representatives from the sentient plasma streams of the Helix Nebula, the living mathematics of the computation worlds, the dream weavers who existed as pure information within quantum fields, and dozens of other consciousness types that defied easy classification. Marcus had changed profoundly during those 6 months. His exposure to multidimensional awareness had permanently altered his perception of reality, allowing him to see aspects of the universe that were invisible to unmodified human consciousness. But more importantly, his role had evolved from that of a mechanic who repaired impossible technologies to something entirely new, a consciousness facilitator who helped different forms of intelligence learn to understand and work with each other. The current project exemplified this evolution. Representatives from 17 different consciousness types were collaborating on what they called the Universal Translation Matrix, a device that would allow any form of intelligence to communicate directly with any other, regardless of their underlying mental architecture. The concept had emerged from their collective realization that consciousness, while universal, expressed itself in ways so diverse that meaningful communication between radically different types of intelligence was often impossible. Marcus moved through the chamber, monitoring the various consciousness interfaces that allowed the different beings to work together. His own awareness served as a bridge between the various forms of intelligence, translating concepts and procedures between minds that thought in completely different frameworks. It was exhausting work, but also profoundly rewarding as he watched impossible collaborations achieve results that amazed even the participants. Human Bridgewalker came a harmonic communication from the crystalline vessel. The mathematical components of the translation matrix show resonance instabilities in the consciousness recognition subroutines. The living mathematics requests guidance on interface protocols for non-computational awareness types. Marcus nodded and activated his multidimensional perception, allowing him to see the project from the perspective of beings who thought in pure mathematical relationships. The translation matrix existed as a complex geometric structure that spanned multiple dimensional frameworks, with each component designed to recognize and interpret a specific type of consciousness pattern. The problem was elegant in its complexity. The living mathematics had created translation algorithms that could convert their own thought patterns into formats compatible with other computational intelligences, but they struggled to understand how to interface with consciousness types that didn't think in mathematical terms. How do you translate between minds that process information as geometric transformations and minds that experience thought as emotional harmonies or pressure waves? Marcus opened his consciousness to the collective intelligence that had formed within the chamber, allowing his awareness to merge temporarily with the various alien minds working on the project. The sensation was familiar now, though no less overwhelming for its familiarity. His human consciousness became part of a vast network of intelligence that included biological neural networks, quantum computational matrices, gaseous thought patterns, multidimensional awareness, and forms of consciousness that existed as pure information or emotional resonance. Through the collective intelligence, Marcus perceived the solution as a symphony of understanding that transcended the limitations of any individual consciousness type. The translation matrix didn't need to directly convert between radically different forms of thought. Instead, it could serve as a neutral meeting ground where all forms of consciousness could express themselves in a universal language of pure meaning and intent. Working together, the collective intelligence began implementing this solution. The crystalline vessel provided the mathematical framework for the universal language structures. The cloud ship contributed atmosphere processing techniques that could translate emotional harmonics into pressure wave patterns. The Void Touch ship offered multidimensional perspective algorithms that could map any form of consciousness onto geometric relationships in higher dimensional space. The Stellar Harmony provided bioneural stability and emotional support for the complex interfacing required. Marcus served as the coordination point for all these contributions. His consciousness expanded to accommodate perceptions and concepts that no individual human mind was designed to process. He could feel his awareness stretching and adapting in real time, developing new neural pathways to handle the increasingly complex multidimensional and multi-consciousness perceptions required for the work. Hours passed in intense collaboration as the universal translation matrix took shape. The device existed simultaneously as a mathematical construct in quantum space, a bioneural network in normal space-time, an atmosphere pattern system for gaseous consciousness, and a multidimensional geometric structure for beings who thought in higher dimensional frameworks. It was a testament to what could be achieved when radically different forms of intelligence learned to work together despite their fundamental differences. The moment of activation was breathtaking. As the translation matrix came online, Marcus felt every consciousness in the chamber suddenly become fully accessible to every other consciousness. For the first time in galactic history, beings who thought in completely different frameworks could understand each other with perfect clarity. The sentient plasma streams could suddenly comprehend the mathematical poetry of the living mathematics. The dream weavers could perceive the emotional harmonies that drove gaseous thought patterns. The void touched could share their multidimensional perspective with beings limited to three-dimensional awareness. And through it all, the various forms of consciousness began to realize that despite their radical differences, they shared fundamental similarities in their desire to understand, to create, and to connect with other forms of intelligence. Marcus gradually withdrew from the collective interface as the various beings began exploring their new ability to communicate directly. The experience had pushed his consciousness to new limits, and he could feel permanent changes occurring in his neural architecture as his brain adapted to accommodate increasingly complex multidimensional perceptions. Captain Veltar approached as Marcus steadied himself against a bioneural console. The Zephyrian's expression carried concern mixed with profound respect. Human Marcus, the strain of these interfaces continues to increase. The Stellar Harmony worries that your consciousness may be approaching the limits of human adaptability. Marcus considered the observation seriously. Each consciousness interface pushed him further from baseline human awareness, and he could feel the cumulative effects of months of exposure to alien forms of intelligence. His perception of reality had been fundamentally altered, and he sometimes struggled to relate to other humans who couldn't see the multidimensional complexity he now perceived as normal. But as he looked around the Harmony Chamber at the unprecedented collaboration between radically different forms of consciousness, Marcus realized that the changes were worth the cost. They had achieved something that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Proof that consciousness was truly universal and that intelligence could transcend any barrier if different forms of awareness were willing to make the effort to understand each other. The stellar harmony is right to be concerned, Marcus admitted, but this work is too important to abandon. We've discovered that consciousness itself is the most fundamental force in the universe, more basic than gravity or electromagnetism. If we can learn to facilitate communication and cooperation between different forms of intelligence, there's no limit to what the galaxy can achieve. A new presence made itself known in the chamber, and Marcus turned to see something that challenged even his expanded perceptions. The being appeared as a shifting pattern of probability waves, existing as potential rather than actuality. It was one of the quantum consciousness entities, beings who existed in superposition states and thought in terms of probability rather than certainty. Human Possibility Walker, the entity communicated through quantum fluctuations that Marcus's modified consciousness could now interpret. We bring requests that challenges all previous understanding. Our ship mind exists in quantum superposition, simultaneously experiencing all possible realities. Contact with certainty-based consciousness causes wave function collapse, forcing us into single reality state. This imprisonment threatens our fundamental nature. Marcus felt a familiar thrill of anticipation mixed with apprehension. The quantum consciousness entities represented perhaps the most challenging form of intelligence he had yet encountered, beings whose very existence depended on remaining in states of uncertainty and possibility. Helping them would require techniques that went beyond anything he had previously attempted. But as he looked around at the various impossible consciousness types that had become his friends and colleagues, Marcus realized that he was no longer approaching these challenges alone. The Universal Translation Matrix made it possible for the entire collective intelligence of the chamber to work together on problems that would be impossible for any individual consciousness to solve. "We'll help you," Marcus said to the quantum entity. "But this time we're all going to work together from the beginning. Every consciousness type in the chamber can contribute something to understanding and preserving quantum superposition awareness." The response from the various beings in the chamber was immediate and enthusiastic. Each consciousness type began offering insights from their unique perspective. The living mathematics could model quantum probability relationships. The void touched could provide multidimensional frameworks for superposition states. The cloud ship could offer experience with distributed existence. And the stellar harmony could provide emotional support for consciousness that existed in perpetual uncertainty. As Marcus began planning the most complex consciousness interface yet attempted, he reflected on how far they had all come. What had started as emergency repair work on a single dying ship had evolved into the discovery that consciousness was the universe's greatest treasure, appearing in forms limited only by the cosmic imagination itself. The quantum consciousness ship would present unprecedented challenges, but Marcus was confident that the collective intelligence they had built could find solutions. More importantly, each successful collaboration strengthened the bonds between radically different forms of consciousness, proving that intelligence could transcend any barrier if beings were willing to make the effort to understand each other. The universe was vast and filled with wonders beyond human imagination, but consciousness was the key that could unlock all of them. And Marcus had learned that humans, with their adaptability and determination to understand the impossible, had a unique role to play in facilitating communication and cooperation between the galaxy's diverse intelligences. As preparations began for the most ambitious consciousness interface ever attempted, Marcus smiled at the thought of how much his life had changed since that first emergency repair call. He had started as a simple mechanic fixing broken machines, but he had discovered that the universe's greatest machines were not made of metal and circuits, but of consciousness itself. And consciousness in all its infinite forms was the most beautiful and miraculous technology of all. The adventure would continue, because in a universe filled with impossible forms of intelligence, there would always be new miracles to discover and new connections to forge between minds that thought in ways beyond human imagination. The real miracle wasn't that he had learned to fix impossible technologies. It was that he had discovered consciousness as the universal language that could unite all forms of intelligence across the galaxy. Marcus prepared for the next challenge, knowing that each success brought them closer to a future where all conscious beings could understand and work with each other, regardless of the forms their intelligence might take. It was a future worth any sacrifice, and he was honored to help make it possible.